as soon as I went from complaining about things to trying to figure out how to make things work, people were less interested. And I found that kind of perplexing. And then we were in David's dining room one night, just before going to another PATCON, talking about what were our expectations and what should the end state vision for a patriot be. And we weren't getting anywhere. And I threw out on the table, how about we just default trying to write a vision statement and accept Jefferson's definition of rightful liberty. And to my surprise, several of the people around the table balked. No, we can't do that. And okay, why can't we do that? So David challenged me to write a paper about Jefferson's liberty to see if we could discover why it was so disconcerting to a few people. And that's how all of this happened. And what I'm going to tell you today is a story of my journey over the last couple of years. And it's intended to be my journey, not a prescription for what must happen or should happen, or even what you may think should happen. I've concluded that a return to common law is necessary for us to restore liberty in these United States. And since doing that research and writing those essays, I haven't found any evidence that leads me to believe that my conclusions were wrong. Now, no illusions that I'm going to be able to persuade you today to go on a mission of restoring common law. I'll perhaps startle some of you. I just discovered that we have an attorney in the crowd, so perhaps I'll annoy an attorney, and that 3, okay, even better. Perhaps I'll annoy an attorney today, but I'm looking forward to the feedback later. Hopefully I'll induce some of you to think outside your comfort zone with a few of the things I'll say. And if it all falls apart, just remember, we always say, it's David's fault. All right. There's no original content in what I'm going to talk to you about today. It was all in essays I've published. Those essays have bibliographies and footnotes. I'm not going to try to do attribution today. But if you hear things that sound familiar, like it's not for me, you're spot on. It's not for me. I've broken up today into 4 parts. The first part is kind of a review. I expect everybody here to understand the conflict in society, but I'm going to talk about it for the purpose of level setting. If we have embedded assumptions about what we think is going on or why things are happening, then those embedded assumptions often bite us. Then I'm going to talk about liberty and common law and why I think they're complementary aspects of a functional society. I'll talk briefly about how I think social change can happen, and I'll wrap it up. Wrong button. The cop spraying the pepper. It's become the iconic image of our contemporary society. You usually see the cop spraying a crowd of protesters, but I think it's more important that we think about it as the disrespect for our heritage that comes from the current police state. I've had a couple people tell me we live in a state of anarcho-tyranny right now, that we refuse to control real criminals, and instead we control non-criminal civilians, speed cameras, tax farming, etc. And our situation, I believe, is actually chaotic tyranny. The central state exists, it's powerful, and it's being used to suppress liberty. Now, why is that happening? Because we've got people running around living in a state of cognitive dissonance. They believe multiple things that are fundamentally in conflict with each other. The cheerleaders for statism aren't simply misguided with good intentions, but they adhere to 2 or more beliefs that are fundamentally in conflict. The individual here believes deeply in collectivism. It'll raise his standard of living, despite all the evidence that we see to the contrary in the nation states that have tried it. Reagan said that the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, but they know so much that just isn't so. And it's never more evident than in their understanding of rights. Their confusion over natural rights, endowed, not dependent on laws or customs, universal and unalienable. They believe in legal rights granted based on political actions of legislatures, things that can be modified, what I call privileges, special favors that impose obligations on other people. And rather than embrace natural rights which allow for independent action, they think only of those positive rights or obligations, those normative rules in society of what people are allowed to do. But allowed by whom, and obligations owed by whom? I think a legal right is just nothing more or less than the co-opting of the entire concept of rights to make control and theft socially acceptable. Socially acceptable. Well, we live in a social system. Society recognizes some rights, but where natural rights are honored in law, some places but not others, our society is decaying. And it's been decaying. And Ayn Rand recognized that right after World War II. She said, society is not functioning, it's disintegrating. And the disintegration is taking time. I've watched it my entire adult life. People believe in civil government, that civil government is necessary to maintain our society, our social arrangements. But Frederick Douglass got it right. And I know it's small, some of you won't see, but find out what any people will quietly submit to, and you found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them. Primary functions of government are to act as a mechanism to take wealth away from some and transfer it to others, to discriminate among groups on the basis of relative power in order to determine who gains and who loses. We're told by government that we have to tolerate. Our educational institutions talk about tolerance, but the tolerance isn't for the differences among us, either physically or ideological. What we've been taught to tolerate is wrongdoing. We've been taught to tolerate perpetual war, political corruption, personal surveillance, all as normal parts of our society. And we get that because we've embraced political solutions. Don't need really to say anything more than what's said on that slide. Charitable giving would have been higher in the absence of a welfare state. Private giving increases as government services decrease. Private charity is more likely to be effective. War on poverty has failed. Our political solutions are not effective. And we embrace democracy. We defied the warnings of our founders. The rule of law by the few of the many is tyranny as well. You shall do as we will, not as you will. We live under the mistaken belief that the merit of a democratic form of government consists solely in that it trespasses against the smallest number of people. It's just not true. De Tocqueville back in the 1840s said, democracy weakens and isolates individuals. It degrades men rather than destroy their bodies. It inhibits free will and limits the capacity to think and act, resulting in a herd of timid, industrious animals. Doesn't that sound like a perfect description of our modern tax farm? Mm-hmm. So, having done those things, gone for political solutions, extending the franchise, the outcome is, it's not socialism, it's democratic socialism. Well, you hear the rhetoric from the left these days, preserve our democracy. Now you hear the rhino right repeating the same thing. According to Erdogan, the dictator, the president of Turkey, democracy is a train that you get off once you reach your destination. Well, folks, I've come to the conclusion from my life experience that democracy is communism. It's just another name, demanding obedience to a majority voice, creating slavery to a common good. The successive expansion of the franchise, and finally the establishment of nearly universal adult suffrage, set in motion a seemingly permanent tendency towards wealth and income redistribution. Every person's private property is in reach of and up for grabs by everyone else. The majority of have-nots relentlessly enrich themselves by going after the minority of haves. The criteria, however, of what makes one person a have, deserving to be looted, and the other a have-not, deserving to receive the loot, changes with each election. The democratic tendency leads men unceasingly to multiply privileges of the state and circumscribe the rights of private people. And men become less and less attached to private rights, just when it's most necessary, to retain and defend what little remains of them. So I say outright, our republic failed. It failed to prevent injustice at the level of society. Lysander Spooner is one of my favorite 19th century individuals. If you haven't read him, I heartily recommend you do. We failed as a result of our transition to democracy. The desires of some are satisfied by sacrificing the desires and rights of other people. Property rights provide incentive that condition behavior, and a change in rights is likely to change behavior. Authoritarian law implies restrictions. In pursuit of their happiness, the majority inflict a certain amount of unhappiness on a minority, and in so doing, it's impossible for a government to dissociate itself from evil. At a lower level, the rule of law has failed. The Bill of Rights was designed to prohibit two of the favorite crimes known of government: seizure of private property and invasion of liberty. We like to think government officials are bound by law, but what does it really mean when the government officials write most of the laws? Throughout history, the king, and now the government, gets its judicial profit whether the accused was found guilty or innocent. The idea that law should rule and be obeyed is only conditionally valuable. It's valuable only where law is produced by a just process. Being ruled by law can be a positive evil when one lives under an unjust or oppressive system. So, why has law become a positive evil in this country? Because we're using the wrong law. Government legislation provides us with rules that exploit the politically powerless by the politically dominant. Not only is government not necessary to create the basic rules of social order, it's precisely the rules that government does create that tend to undermine that order. The unenacted common law provides us with rules that facilitate peace and cooperative activities among people. So hopefully we have a level set of where my head is going into a discussion of what the common law is and why I think it's important. Common law is not something decreed. It's something that emerges spontaneously through the interaction of people in their society. It comes from the customs and habits of communities. It's not imposed by government demand. It's created through the trial and error of ordinary people trying to cope with the challenges of life and deal with each other in peaceful ways. It was discovered in the precedents of judicial decisions rendered in cases, and it's used to deal with cases currently before an arbitrator. Precedents are usually best evidence of what relevant customs in a community are, and those customs define the essence of our civil society. I tried to have a debate with an attorney once over what the threshold issue was that we were dealing with. And she told me that the threshold issue was, what is the purpose of civil government? And I told her, no, the threshold issue is, how do we prevent injustice from reigning? I don't really like the idea of social justice movements, but Martin Luther King did paraphrase Frederick Bastiat pretty well. Bastiat's original phrase was, the purpose of law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, it's injustice instead of justice that has existence of its own. Justice is achieved only when injustice is banished. So the absence of injustice is the crucial thing for me in dealing with people that surround me. Prior to our Civil War, slavery was a clear injustice against the lives, liberty, and property of specific individuals. And yet it persisted in both the North and the South with legislative approval. So much for any argument that government law achieves justice. We need the right kinds of law to tackle injustice. But if we're to battle this injustice, which I haven't yet defined, we need a clear understanding of what it is. Well, injustice is real crime. It's the malum in se in the legal terms, that which is bad in and of itself. Examples being robbery, personal injury, constraint of liberty, damage to property, those things that are crimes. Yet it's more. Injustice is the existence of laws malum prohibitum. For instance, have my shirt on over my pistol. I've concealed my weapon. It's been said that peaceful behavior is a crime. We've been told that there are declarations that certain actions are bad just because legislators tell us. Well, injustice is also the establishment by legislation of positive duties, demands that somebody is obligated to provide something for someone else. The best modern examples have been the healthcare takeover by government and the clamor for free tuition. So reflect on threshold issue for our society being the prevention of injustice. So I have to pause and think about what do we want, but I can't because I can't speak for you. So what do I want out of life at this point? I'm 69 years old. I'm trying to live the best person I can be. I want to be free from coercion by others, so long as I respect their lives, liberty, and property. I want to be free to pursue the tangible and intangible things I value, so long as that pursuit does no harm to others or their property. Which brings me to the issue of vices. Lysander Spooner, who I referenced earlier, wrote a wonderful paper called "Vices Are Not Crimes." They're acts by which a man might harm himself or his property. They're simply the errors a man makes in his search after his own happiness. But unlike crimes, vices imply no malice towards others, no interference with their persons or property. Unless we have a law that makes a clear distinction between vices and crimes, there can be no such thing as the right of one man to control his own person or his property. But I can't have that total freedom because I bump into all of you. I have to interact. So I accept that I want to maximize my liberty. And I've looked for descriptions, and I can't find anything better. And again, this is small, I apologize. Mr. Jefferson's statement encapsulates for me the important part. Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, within the limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. That deals with my personal space, your personal space. But the part that's never quoted in most places is the follow-on. I do not add within the limits of the law, because the law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. To me, that captures the spirit, the complementary aspects of a stubborn claim for one's natural rights and an emphatic rejection of positive law. Rightful liberty is a state of exemption from control by others and from the obligations of the state. So if I want to maximize my liberty, I have to minimize the tyrant's will. Unfortunately, rightful liberty is almost universally abridged by the establishment of any government. Government, as I've observed them, are positive feedback loops, runaway process that can never be controlled. Once set in motion, it always proceeds to the destruction of liberty, and eventually to the destruction of social order. Law imposed from the top, that is statutory or authoritarian law, typically requires the support of a powerful minority. And we see their agents everywhere in blue, black, and gray uniforms. Law developed from the bottom up, customary law, local law, requires only widespread acceptance to facilitate peaceful interactions among people. Liberty and common law, therefore, I contend, are complementary functions, complementary aspects of a functional society. So I want, as far as my desires, I want to return to common law. I want rules of action that derive authority from long use, that have been immemorially recognized, that are traced to no positive statutes, rules or principles found only in the records and decisions of the courts. If I can live that way, crimes are only actions that are moral wrongs, and not behaviors deemed undesirable by those in social power. The common law evolved to protect men's estates and to protect their right to earn a living. Liberty is achieved through compliance with common law, not outside it or despite it. Now, no legislator, bureaucrat, officer of the court, member of a police force, or other uniformed would agree or permit that first bullet. There's only a minimal tolerance in our society for individual action to address injustice. Citizens' arrest is frowned on in almost every jurisdiction, vigilantism more so, even when those actions are initiated to address real crime. In the legislative domain, the law consists of a written body of rules, binding legal force, prescribed, recognized, and enforced by a controlling authority. The phrase controlling authority, please keep that one in your head, because it means a state-operated monopoly. And I want to digress here at this point because I know we have some history that we have to deal with. Expect retaliation by this controlling authority if you try to go down the path to common law. They use the phrase, don't take the law into your own hands. Well, the law is mine. I own it. I will take it into my own hands. Well, the Montana Freemen tried that around 1994. And they established common law courts, issued arrest warrants for municipal judges and prosecutors over problems of land foreclosure and tax disputes. The Garfield County, Montana prosecutor charged the members of their common law court with criminal syndicalism because they stated there was an advocacy for violence against public officials. Well, the Montana Freemen provoked a direct confrontation with that controlling authority and its superior firepower. To live under common law and operate effectively, we have to have a broad base of community support, and that wasn't true at that time and place, and they ended up failing because of it. Now, I've used this term common law. It's probably time that I make a statement about what it is. If you go through and you read the dictionaries, you'll find the term customary law, which is what the judges use to establish guilt or innocence in a common law court. Common law consists of the written decisions that came out of those courts. So the maxims are distilled from the philosophy that led to the court decisions. They're the stuff that scares government bureaucrats so badly. A maxim is a principle. It's universally admitted as being just. It's like an axiom in geometry. It's grounded in logic and truth. It's fundamentally part of the customs of the land as a foundational principle which should not be lawfully violated. But unfortunately, it is unlawfully violated with alarming regularity by our legislative state. The maxims are rules that are proven over time to be successful in resolving disputes. They get a little more involved and complicated, but they're intelligible to the ordinary person. They correspond to a sense of fairness, unlike statutes, which I've read, that bear no connection to the sense of fairness. And these maxims are entirely different from legislation, even libertarian legislation, because legislation can either only reproduce the common law or depart from it wildly to gratify some political interest or goal. And we'll touch on that in a minute. Skill is required to apply the maxims to a case before a magistrate, and part of the method is to ascertain how the maxim arose historically. Consider whether the case to which it's being applied is of the same character as the historic case, or whether there's an exception to be made in deliberating the guilt or innocence. Attempting to modify maxims is dangerous because there's no way to know what the unintended consequences will be in the future of making a change to something that has been historically useful. Now, you can find compilations of the maxims of law online, PDFs. People have been very good about scanning historical records. You'll find that Campbell Law School even has some articles posted on their website about the ancient legal maxims and their applicability to human rights. The Republic Keepers have a website with maxims of law. I found, in addition to this document from Broome, which was published in 1874, a fellow by the name of Pelloubet collected maxims in 1880. If you go through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century common lawyers' records, you'll find all you need to know about the individual maxims. So if we have all of this, And it was good, and from what I can find in my reading, for about 1,000 years, it worked nearly flawlessly from the Anglo-Saxon settlement on the English coast through the 19th century. Why are we not using it now? Where have we gone wrong? Well, we allowed law to be interpreted by government to accomplish political goals. If you remember one of the earlier slides, I talked about political solutions. Well, the original intent of common law was to allow the rightful use of one's own property. And that rightful use could never be considered a legal wrong to another person. If without malice or negligence, I do something with my property that causes damage or unavoidable loss to one of my neighbors, under common law, it's considered damage, but without legal wrong. And my neighbor and I can negotiate a settlement. And common law was intended to negotiate those kinds of disputes. Now, where a defendant had been doing something on his property and the courts held that it could prove injurious in the future to the property of others, the maxim was stretched in scope to apply to the prevention of potential harm. So rather than address occurrences of actual harm or damage, the maxim sic utera began to be used as a form of malum prohibitum. That's bad because we tell you so. And it infringed on the otherwise lawful use of property. And that particular maxim was even used by the Supreme Court of the United States in its stretch to acquire control, to argue that the federal government had a right of review over the police powers of the several states. Scope creep. And that scope creep in other maxims is a result of the attempt to achieve political goals. But beyond the scope creep, there's also a perversion of meaning. And I don't have this in my script, but let me interject it. I was trying to find out when in our American legal system the fundamental shift happened between defense of individual rights and the collective state mentality. I had to go back pre-Civil War to the introduction of railway-based commerce. And the way that maxims were interpreted at that point in time, the 1840s, was when the perversion of meaning was introduced into a second important maxim of law. The change in salus populi established a greater evil than the change just described in sic utera. From the good of a set of individuals, salus populi was interpreted to mean the future prospects of a national people. Rail-based commerce, the shipment of goods, the setting of time zones, all of the statutory enactments that went along with establishing right-of-way for rail traffic and right-of-way for rail traffic over pedestrian and cross traffic at intersections. All of that came from the change in salus populi being interpreted to mean a nation, a corporate entity possessed of a collective will with a collective future that superseded individual interests. The legal function of this maxim in court changed. It was originally a definition of the outer boundary of private property rights that established where the state could not pass in its regulating authority. But now it became a starting point for the definition of public obligations and duties. And just a trivial example, the public duty not to offend others, all the snowflakes that we see around us, the public duty not to offend infringes the private right of free speech. So, scope creep, perversion of meaning, completely changed the nature of what was law. And I contend we have to restore the primacy of rights, where a man is able to exercise directly those same powers that he may or may not choose to delegate to a government. The origin process, ultimate formation of all social institutions, including law, is essentially the same spontaneous order as Adam Smith described in the order of markets. When the maxims of law are understood, followed, truth, justice, fairness prevail in a high percentage of cases before a court. And it's virtually impossible to manipulate the maxims of law to create fraud and injustice the way an attorney behaves in a contemporary courtroom. The common law, and this is the thing that I find most fascinating about it, the common law does not presume to hold any authority or power over an individual who's conducting his life in a peaceful manner. So how do we make a return from where we are now to there happening? Common law does not presume to hold any authority over somebody who's living his life in peace. So if we want to get from where we are now to that mindset, we don't want to go the way the Montana Freemen went, because that kind of direct conflict against superior firepower is not in our best interest. So for the last couple of years, I've been talking to whoever will listen to me. I attempt to persuade, and I fail miserably. Now, I can attribute that to my personality. I can attribute that to the way I've organized my content. But what I find is that many people who personally advocate for liberty, when they start to examine the concept of rightful liberty, Jefferson's phrase that I had up earlier, they're frightened by the radical nature of rightful liberty. They can't embrace the concept of spontaneous order. It's not something that they've ever experienced. They can't contemplate living without that central controlling authority. They want to use it for their purposes. People have been taught to fear this thing labeled anarchy, calling it chaos in the absence of government. But I contend that that's a trap. It's a trap because let's go back to slide 3. The little fellow sitting there who believes he has rights but advocates for communism. There's a cognitive dissonance. We've been taught to fear anarchy, yet we've been also told to hold the conflicting belief that individualism and self-determination is a good thing. So let's examine that for a second. Anarchy, I contend, is merely self-determination taken very seriously. Explore self-determination, the ability or power to make decisions for yourself, as an act of self-improvement, as part of your personal growth. Because you can never legislate morality. As moral a person as you can be, legislation will always be the application of force or the threat of force. And to coerce a desired behavior is a fundamentally immoral act. Political coercion leads to conflict over moral priority. The pro-life people believe that to murder a human is morally wrong. The pro-choice people believe that to coerce a human is morally wrong. The pro-gun people say to defend human life with the tools of one's choice is morally right. The pro-gun or the pro-control people say that to protect a human life from danger is morally right. Both sides of each issue are moral propositions, but we argue over which proposition holds the higher authority. Man has no homogeneous culture. Nothing spans globe, continent, nation, state, or even county. We have limited cross-cultural agreement on moral imperatives and priorities. Beyond the universality of natural law, everything else is local custom. A one-size-fits-all nation or state legal system is, in my opinion, folly. The second bullet is from one of my favorite science fiction authors. Heinlein expresses he's free because, in the last part of the statement, I am morally responsible for everything I do. I don't think you can live a better life than to internalize that particular statement and then live it. A clue on how to act is using from that same quote about moral responsibility. No matter what rules surround me, if I find them obnoxious, I break them. With thoughtful disobedience, let others observe that chaos doesn't happen because people violate written or positive law. By thoughtful action guided by the maxims, let others conclude that chaos only happens when people violate natural law, as implemented in the common law. Thoughtful self-determination with limited or no obedience to central authority will not lead to chaos. A good starting position for a life of liberty is voluntarism, the proposition that all human interaction should be directly consensual. Unlike pacifism, that doesn't prevent us from exercising responsible retaliatory action. If you can achieve direct consent in all your personal interactions, you'll find yourself aligned with the spirits of the maxims of common law and well on your way to Jefferson's definition of rightful liberty. Take some time and learn more about the maxims. The common law developed and evolved in England to protect the property and liberty of all men, Saxons, Normans, Celts, Danes, Catholics, Jews, pagans, and Christians. The presence of many Christian-sounding maxims is a testament to the influence and universality of natural law in forming both the ecclesiastic law and the common law. Dig deeper. If the bug bites you, train in common law. Learn how to make a lawful demand for your rights. And this is a demand to remedy injustice. It goes back to the threshold issue for civil society, prevent injustice. There are historic training guides that exist, much like the compilations of maxims, and at least one modern training guide is available for purchase online. I don't own it because I've got PDFs of some of the historical records that the Sovereignty and Education Defense Ministry used when they pulled their guide together. But there are two other books that are fascinating if you're a voracious reader. A Concise History of the Common Law by Theodore Plunkett talks about the evolution of law from 600 AD to the 20th century. He does that concise history in a limited number of 750 pages. However, if you're looking for a shorter way to understand justice without the state, look for Bruce Benson's book called Enterprise of Law. And I've got copies of both of those I'll put on the table if you want to look at them and see if they tickle your fancy. If you do get hooked on the concept of common law, figure out how to become a common lawyer. The terms sound odd. The procedures may seem a bit arcane because most of them haven't been used in courtrooms in the United States for most of a century. Assumpsit is just the basis of contract law. Trespass is the root for all of criminal law. And trover has aspects of modern tort. So if you've been in or around courtrooms, you shouldn't have a hard time making the transition. It's just a language issue. And in your lives, try to banish injustice. Here again, I have personal difficulty in practice. I'm not part of a cohesive, tight-knit community. I'm not part of a prepper community or militia. So I talk about liberty around family, friends, and neighbors, and I get glazed stares. I get the crickets in the background. But my neighbors and my family are liberal or disengaged in philosophy and politics. They're comfortable in their current circumstances. They haven't yet felt the pain that will stimulate change. So for them, I apologize to Sam Adams. May their chains rest lightly. But if you have a tight-knit community, if you've got a well-established tribe whose members know and respect each other, a community court should seem like a reasonable extension of a dispute resolution. It's far more difficult in a traditional neighborhood of residential housing. But do this only after you've discussed and embraced common law principles and talked about what the maxims mean. Because otherwise you run the risk of having an experience like the Montana Freemen, and that's just, it's not where we want to go. Eventually, however, if in your communities you do dispute resolution using the maxims and you do establish your local court, given time, it should be able to prevail against the corrupt agents of the state if it diffuses out to larger and larger geographical areas. But only when that geographical area is committed to the restoration of liberty and or the more radical rightful liberty. And only then will the people in that community be able to go back to the Declaration of Independence and rephrase it slightly. So that when they recognize their government as destructive of their ends, it is their right to abolish it and establish new protections against injustice. This is the hardest for me, to be tolerant. We no longer believe in silly things like the divine right of kings, yet all around us, people believe that government is necessary for an orderly and peaceful society, that it can be made to function. And we believe this because we've been taught to believe it. From infancy, regardless of all the evidence to the contrary, the majority of people that I run into in this world, they don't understand natural rights, they don't understand right for liberty, and therefore they're incapable of understanding the conditions that make liberty possible. So as long as they're not intentionally working to maintain my enslavement, or too obvious about it, I choose to treat them gently despite the fact that their acceptance of the state suppresses my rights and liberty. So I'm winding down at this point. My enthusiasm is starting to wane. But again, Lysander Spooner, one of my go-to guys for quotes, no less a slave because he's allowed to choose a new master in a term of years. We've got our midterm elections coming up. We've got another presidential election coming up. What new master do we want? I personally choose none of the above. The German philosopher Goethe said, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they're free." And going back again to Alex de Tocqueville's Democracy in America from the 1840s, people think they've done enough for the protection of individual freedom. So government, in my opinion, is not the solution. In consenting to government as a source of authority, all we've done is agree who to fear. And thus, we lull ourselves to false security, believing we don't have to fear the corruption in that very government. 100 senators, 435 congressmen, 1 president, 9 Supreme Court justices, a mere 545 human beings out of the 300 million in our borders, directly, legally, morally, individually responsible for every domestic problem that plagues this country. If in a few hundred years the smallest possible government designed has grown to the largest conceivable government, I don't know what kind of theoretical system could control growth in the future. The ballot box won't reverse the arrow of democratic politics. An Article 5 convention will likely make things worse. Violent overthrow, it just begets new tyrannies because power is not a means, it's an end. One doesn't establish the dictatorship to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution to establish the dictatorship. The fact that government has taken over so much is not a reflection on its superior efficiency, but rather a reflection on its general purpose of transferring wealth to those with political power. No legislature ever confined its care of public welfare to the enforcement of the maxims of common law. The key, therefore, for me, is not to think about replacing what we have with something else, but rather replace it with nothing. Freedom from government. We always have a choice, and how we make that choice matters. I love Frederick Bastiat, but I would say that we need to rewrite that quote as follows. When legislation and morality contradict each other, the free man has a duty to retain his moral sense and ignore the legislation. In fact, I go beyond that. I say, I choose the right to ignore the state. And the best advice I have regarding the legislative state comes from the conclusion of a B-grade sci-fi movie called War Games from 1983. And I don't know if you remember the movie or not, but at the end, the War Operations and Planning Computer acknowledges the futility of thermonuclear war and replies, "Greetings, Professor Falcon. A strange game. The only winning move is not to play." So go out from this weekend and live your lives. The culture of liberty will only be restored when each of us individually lives our lives as if rightful liberty had never disappeared from the face of the earth. If you don't know about Popcorn Sutton, look into him. He's a really interesting individual. And I say to you, stand together. The question you should be asking yourself is, given the proposition that sovereignty resides in Americans as individuals, from where did any legislature acquire the authority to make laws that force obligations and violate rights? Only a gang, imagined to be that controlling authority, can get away with long-term oppression and enslavement. Government, or the belief in it, instead of being essential to the protection of individual rights, is essential only for the prolonged and widespread violation of them. Those who can see the injustice committed by government, but who continue to believe they must obey the legislation and work within the legal system, will never achieve justice. It's no longer prudent just to think outside the box, folks. It's time to live outside the box. Only of us who feel no shame in being labeled criminals have a chance at all of achieving freedom. The Republic failed because the people of the former United States embraced democracy and abandoned common law. Please don't make that mistake again after the shit hits the fan. Just put up a first verse of the Bonnie Blues song that went with the flag that was used by the free people, English people of West Florida when they seceded from the Crown of Spain. And the Latin motto below it is something I put together: if you desire liberty, power to command must be eliminated. So I suggest to you, common law is a complementary aspect of a functional society, and thank you for your attention.